Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, my name is Ali. I'm a final year medical student at Cambridge University, and this is video number 4 in our mini-series about medical ethics aimed at preparing you for your medicine interviews, hopefully to stand out a little bit beyond the bare minimum. In today's video, we're going to be talking about legalizing assisted suicide. And if you look in the description below, you'll see timestamps to absolutely everything, so you can just kind of hit the appropriate timestamp if you don't want to watch this video all in one go. But I would suggest that you watch video number 3, the video about euthanasia, before watching this one, because that is sort of the foundational stuff that you need to know. That introduces the case of Dr. Cox, it introduces terms like active euthanasia, passive euthanasia, physician-assisted suicide, and it kind of explains the law in the UK surrounding that. And the law is, just to remind you, it's currently illegal. Physician-assisted suicide is illegal, and any form of euthanasia is illegal. But there is a big debate around this, and in this video we're going to be tackling some of the issues and explaining some of the ethics and the law side of assisted suicide. Okay, so we're jumping forward a day into the future now, and I've just finished editing this video and realized that I went a bit overboard on explaining the law surrounding assisted suicide. And that's objectively not very high yield information if you're preparing for your medicine interviews. So if you are here to get some focused revision done for your medicine interviews, please could you skip to this timestamp, and in the last 10 minutes of the video, that's where we've really got the high value stuff in terms of the ethics surrounding euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide, and that's the sort of stuff that they're very likely to ask in your interviews. Whereas the first 16 minutes or so of this video are about the law surrounding assisted suicide and interesting cases. And it's interesting stuff, but the chances are you're not going to be asked about that in your interview. So if you're interested in this topic, then watch the first 16 minutes as well. Otherwise, I won't be offended at all if you skip to the final 10 minutes. But yeah, this timestamp is where you want to go if you're just here to prepare for your medicine interviews. Yeah, sorry about that. So in terms of structure, we're going to start by talking about family-assisted suicide. What is the legal status of, for example, if you're unfortunate enough to be in the terminal stages of a disease and are thinking of ending your life? Are you allowed to ask your husband or your wife to help you with that act? That's what we're going to start off by talking about, and we're going to be talking about some well-known cases that have helped change the law in the UK around this. The law in the UK used to be quite draconian with regards to assisted suicide. It has changed a little bit in the last sort of 25-30 years. So that's family-assisted suicide. Then we're going to end by talking about physician-assisted suicide, and physician-assisted suicide is still very black and white in the UK. It is completely illegal for a physician to help someone to commit suicide. But we're going to be talking about kind of the ethics around this and having a little bit of a discussion about pros and cons and arguments for and against physician-assisted suicide. So before we begin, I just want to say that we're going to be talking about suicide and assisted suicide and euthanasia and family members helping one another to commit suicide and doctors maybe helping patients to end their own lives. We're going to be talking about this fairly heavy area, and we're going to be doing it in quite a candid fashion. Please don't think that this is kind of required information that you have to know if you want to get into medical school. I realize this can be a difficult area for a lot of people, and I don't want you to think as if, if you don't kind of confront these issues right now head on, then you're not going to be a good doctor or things like that. Those will come with time, but this is very much kind of optional knowledge that will maybe help you in your medicine interviews, but it's not the sort of thing that, they won't give you an offer just because you don't know much about suicide or you don't really want to talk about it, that sort of thing. So yeah, please consider this a fair sort of content warning. We're going to be talking quite candidly about suicide, but please don't feel like you have to watch this video in order to get into medical school, because that's just not true. And there will be so much scope for kind of tackling these issues with professional help and with the help of the faculty and stuff when you hopefully do get into medical school. So yeah, let's leave it at that, and let's now talk about family-assisted suicide. Okay, so why are we talking about this concept of family-assisted suicide? The reason is because of the Suicide Act 1961, which is a piece of UK legislation that makes it illegal for anyone to assist someone else's suicide. So whether that's giving them a pill that they can take themselves that would help them end their own lives, or whether it's helping them get on a plane and fly to Switzerland to go to the Dignitas clinic where they can end their own life. All of these are illegal under the Suicide Act. So why is this a problem? This is a problem because a lot of people argue that this is inherently discriminatory against physically disabled people. So if you're an able-bodied person, then legally speaking, you're allowed to commit suicide. And you are physically able to commit suicide, and to put it bluntly, there's not much stopping you from committing suicide. But if you're in the terminal stages of an illness where you're now physically disabled, you no longer have the physical capability to commit suicide yourself, even if you wanted to. So by virtue of having this terminal illness, if you want to end your own life, you have to get help because you physically can't do it yourself. And I suppose the most obvious to use that word, people that might help you do this are your family, which is why we're calling this family-assisted suicide. Now, when the Suicide Act came out, family-assisted suicide was illegal, and in fact, family-assisted suicide is still illegal, technically speaking. But over the last 25-30 years, there have been a few high-profile cases where people have tried to change the law on family-assisted suicide, and now we're a bit less draconian in the UK than we used to be in the past. So I'm going to be talking to you about some of the cases in the UK that have helped shape the law surrounding family-assisted suicide. I'll be doing it in quite broad brushstrokes, but if you look in the description, you'll find links to more information about all of these cases, which you can read up by yourself if you feel like it. The first case that we're going to talk about is that of Diane Pretty, and she had motor neuron disease, which in the final stages, as you might know, is physically disabling, so she wasn't able to take her own life. And in 2002, she wanted her husband to help her commit suicide, but naturally they were both concerned that if the husband did help her commit suicide, then he would be prosecuted. And I mean, you can imagine it's a hard enough time for the family as it is, let alone having this threat of breaking the law and being criminally prosecuted for assisting suicide kind of hanging over them. So Diane Pretty made her case in the UK, and it went so far as the European Court of Human Rights. And what she argued was that one of the human rights that we have, one of the articles of the European Convention of Human Rights, is a right to be free from torture or inhuman or degrading treatment. She argued that if the UK wouldn't allow her husband to help her commit suicide, then they were essentially going against her right not to suffer inhuman or degrading treatment, because she would be suffering that treatment because of her disease. And therefore she wanted her husband to not be prosecuted for helping her commit suicide, because to not do so would mean that the state is infringing on her right not to be tortured or suffer inhuman or degrading treatment. She also cited Article 2 and Article 8 of the Human Rights Act. More information on that in the description. That's more kind of very advanced stuff. But that was essentially her argument. So she didn't end up winning this. The European Court of Human Rights said that it was not the state's fault that she had this terminal illness. That was the fault of the disease, and she was suffering at the hands of the disease rather than at the hands of the state. So while she made a good case and was very right to take the case to the European Court of Human Rights, ultimately she didn't win, and she died in 2002 from natural causes from motor neuron disease. So the next case that really did shape the UK's kind of law on this is the case of Debbie Purdy. So she was a lady who had MS, multiple sclerosis, and she was in a similar position in that towards the end stages of her disease, she would be physically unable to take her own life. And what she argued against the courts was that at the moment she was physically fairly fine, and because of the law against assisted suicide, because her husband wouldn't be allowed to help her commit suicide further down the line, she felt compelled to end her life sooner than she should have done. So she was at a high level of physical ability, and at that point she felt that she had no choice other than to take her own life at this point, because she knew that further down the line, in a few years' time maybe, when she becomes more physically disabled, her husband would not be allowed to help her end her own life. So I hope that makes sense. It's a little bit tricky to get your head around, but her main argument was that this current legislation in the Suicide Act is encouraging people to end their lives sooner than they would normally want to, because they don't want their family members to get prosecuted. And this was the case that actually resulted in a change in law. So the DPP, the Director of Public Prosecutions, in response to this case, completely agreed with her and issued guidelines saying that, okay, as long as these criteria are met, we won't technically prosecute people for assisting suicide. So, at the moment, legally speaking, assisting someone to commit suicide is still illegal by the Suicide Act of 1961. But because of these guidelines issued by the Director of Public Prosecutions, we now have a better idea as to who's going to get prosecuted and who won't be prosecuted. In general, again, we'll put a link in the description below if you want to read these guidelines. It's not required reading by any means, but it's pretty common sense stuff. In general, if you're a family member and your spouse or whatever wants to end their own life, and you've made every effort to convince them otherwise, and you're not gaining anything financially from it, and just stuff like that where this is kind of the only option you have left. There's like 16 different criteria, and most of these circumstances that we talk about would fall under that. The term they use is grudging acquiescence. Almost, it's like you've tried what you can, and the only option left is that your family member wants to end their life because they're going to be suffering too much, and in the absence of any other options, then you've assisted them to go to Switzerland to end their own life, for example. And those would be grounds for not being prosecuted. So if you're in that position where you've had to make this difficult choice, you've tried to convince them otherwise, you're pretty confident that you won't be prosecuted by the state for helping assist suicide. There are some reasons as to why you might be prosecuted. So for example, if you're gaining financially, if you don't know the person, if you're a random stranger, if you have helped more than one person to commit suicide, you know, all these things that kind of make it a bit more shady, a bit more suspicious, that make it less simple than a case of, you know, a husband being forced to help his wife die because that's all that's left to them. So again, yeah, link in the description, you can check this out. But essentially what we want to understand is that these guidelines have effectively made it so that this discrimination against physically disabled people is less severe than it used to be. Previously, if you were physically disabled, you weren't physically able to take your own life, therefore you would need help, but if your husband helped you, then he would be at risk of prosecution. Now, you still can't take your own life, but now if your husband helps you, then he's very unlikely to be prosecuted provided these criteria are met. One important thing to mention, one of the criteria in favor of being prosecuted, that if you fulfill this criteria then you will be prosecuted, is that if you're a healthcare professional. And this is what makes physician-assisted suicide very, very illegal. It's illegal anyway, but if you're a healthcare professional, even if you're not operating in your capacity as a healthcare professional, then for you to help someone to commit suicide would be illegal and would be in contravention of these guidelines, and you'd probably get prosecuted for it. So we had a lecture about this a few months ago, and someone asked, what if you're a doctor, but you know you're assisting your wife to commit suicide, but not in your capacity as a doctor, just, you know, the fact that she's your wife and she's asked you to help. And the response we got was that still probably would get you prosecuted just because you're a healthcare professional. So the law is very, very strict around this. If you're a healthcare professional in any kind of capacity at all, you're not allowed to help someone commit suicide, even if it's your own family member and even if you're not really operating in your role as a healthcare professional. So yeah, it is sort of a grey area because it's not technically in legislation, it's just a series of guidelines, but that's the state of the law at the moment. It's very, very dangerous for a healthcare professional to help someone to commit suicide. So that was the case of Debbie Purdy. She was the one who helped change kind of the way the UK responds to family members helping their family to commit suicide. The final case I want to talk to you about is that of Daniel James. And Daniel James was a rugby player, fairly young, I think he was in his 20s, when he ended up being paralysed from the neck downwards. And after a few years of trying to live like this, he realised that he couldn't live a life like this, and he needed help. He needed his parents to help him go to Switzerland, go to Dignitas, so that he could end his life. And naturally, you can imagine the position his parents were in, or maybe not. It's hard for anyone to imagine the position they must have been in. But eventually, they did concede, and they did help him go to Switzerland to end his life. And they weren't prosecuted because this falls precisely into the guidelines that the Director of Public Prosecutions mentioned. You know, there's no hint of foul play here. They're not medical professionals. They're just, you know, distraught parents who've recognized that their son is in a state where he doesn't want to continue living anymore, and they've had to make this terrible kind of decision, this terrible sacrifice, but for his own benefit, because that's what he wanted. So that's probably one of the more well-known cases in this whole debate about assisted suicide. So that's family-assisted suicide. Again, quite a heavy topic. Apologies for that, but you know, there's no real way around it when discussing these issues. Let's now talk about physician-assisted suicide, and that is where the law is very clear in the UK. Physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia and passive euthanasia are all completely illegal, and if any physician were to help a patient to commit suicide, they wouldn't really have a leg to stand on in court. They would be prosecuted. But physician-assisted suicide is legal in quite a lot of countries. It's legal in the Netherlands, it's legal in Switzerland, it's legal in some states in the US. I think Oregon was the first to allow it. And in my opinion, this, like, at some point, the UK's law will probably change to allow physician-assisted suicide in some form or another. I think that's the way the world is going, as we're becoming more libertarian, almost more like, you know, I've got my life, I have a right to choose when my life will end, more kind of towards that region. So I think we're moving towards physician-assisted suicide at some point being legalized in some form or another. let's cut to a segment of Charlotte and Molly briefly mentioning the Lord Falconer bill. Lord Falconer tried to put an assisted suicide bill through Parliament in 2015, and it was not successful. We don't really need to know all the details about it. Again, link in the description for those who want to find out more. But here's Charlotte and Molly talking about the Lord Falconer bill.
So we've talked about some cases that have happened in the past that have become really important in this discussion. We just want to make you aware that it was only a couple of years ago that Lord Falconer tried to bring a bill through the House of Lords that would make assisted suicide legal. And we'll link in the description that you can follow to get some more information about Lord Falconer's bill. The important thing we want you to know is that Lord Falconer's bill was thrown out of the House of Commons. So when MPs heard about it and voted on it, they voted overwhelmingly against it. And so you can see that this is only a couple of years ago, and so it remains a really current issue. This will continue to be brought up again and again because it's a really emotive subject. It's something that people care really passionately about because they have seen loved ones suffering, and they have seen people having a really difficult experience at the end of their lives, and so people are really emotionally invested in this, and so it will continue to come up, and so it's a really important thing to have an awareness of going into medical interviews.
Okay, so yeah, you can read more about Lord Falconer's bill from the links in the description below. I think the thing to mention at this point is that because it was so recent, it was 2015. We're in 2018 right now. I'm not quite sure when you're watching this video, if it's still around in a few years' time, but it's still going to be quite recent. And because it was thrown out of Parliament with such a majority, it's unlikely that someone is going to bring another bill into Parliament in the near future because of how badly this one did. But, you know, maybe 10 years down the line, you know, the public perception of this will change, and we'll see what happens. So that's the legal side of things. Now we're into this area about, you know, the ethics around physician-assisted suicide, the ethics around euthanasia. And we're going to cut to a segment of Charlotte and Molly kind of discussing with one another some of the arguments in favour of assisted suicide and some of the arguments against assisted suicide. And I think if you were to be asked anything in an interview, it'll probably be more the ethics side of things rather than the law side of things. The law side of things is quite niche. It's more the stuff you get taught in medical school. We're just including this because it's interesting and it might help you stand out if you can mention it. But the ethics of assisted suicide, that's stuff that, you know, you could quite feasibly come up with in an interview, and you could quite feasibly be asked. So yeah, here's Charlotte and Molly talking about the for and against the ethics of assisted suicide. Here we go.
So we've talked a bit about the law and how it relates to euthanasia and assisted suicide. And now what we'll do is just have a quick discussion to give you an idea of the ethical arguments for and against the legalisation of assisted suicide and euthanasia. So in this little bit, I'll be arguing for euthanasia being legalised, and Charlotte will be arguing against.
There are a few important arguments to consider that are used by people to say why euthanasia and assisted suicide should not be legalised. So the first is that we have palliative care. Palliative care is a speciality which focuses entirely on relieving people's symptoms and dealing with end-of-life care. And so if we have good palliative care, it shouldn't be necessary to end someone's life to relieve their symptoms. We should be able to treat them and make them comfortable without ending their life. So that's one argument. If we talk to palliative patients, they actually will tell us that some months ago they wanted to die there and then, but actually now they've been given good palliative care, they're really happy that they're still here. They're really happy that they've had that extra time with their families and they've been supported and their symptoms have been controlled.
So a counter argument to that might be that actually doctors are meant to be acting again under those 4 pillars that we talked about in a previous video. So we've got beneficence, non-maleficence, autonomy and justice. So you could talk about beneficence and say actually a doctor is aiming to minimise harm to a patient and to minimise pain. And if a patient at the end of their life or at some point in their life is experiencing such horrendous symptoms and such awful side effects from a serious illness that they feel they want to end their own life, then as a doctor, are you not helping and as a doctor, are you not acting under those terms of beneficence by ending their life sooner? Because actually, some would argue that you're actually causing more harm by letting that patient live for longer. And if we look under autonomy instead, then some would argue that actually a patient is allowed to decide what they do, and anyone is able to decide if they commit suicide or they decide to remain living. And in this instance, not allowing someone to commit suicide is actually infringing upon their autonomy, which is one of those pillars that we really think is important in medical practice.
So autonomy is really important in medicine, but we also have to think about, on a bigger scale, protection of people who are vulnerable. And one of the arguments that people use to say that euthanasia and assisted suicide shouldn't be made legal is that vulnerable people, elderly people, might feel under pressure to end their lives in this way because they feel in some way that they are a burden to their families, they are a burden to the NHS. And by legalising euthanasia and assisted suicide, that we will be putting those people at risk. And so even though autonomy is important, the consideration of the general public and the greater good of the public would be that assisted suicide and euthanasia remained illegal.
So I would counter that argument by actually saying that there are vulnerable people who are being discriminated against by not allowing them access to physician-assisted suicide. So as Debbie Purdy argued earlier on, actually you could say that the people who this affects are people who are unable, because of a disability or a medical condition, to commit suicide themselves. So anyone else out there, an able-bodied person, would be perfectly within their rights and able to commit suicide if they so wished. Whereas these people are a subset of people who want to commit suicide but are unable to do so without any help. And so you could argue actually that although vulnerable people might be put at risk, you're also putting vulnerable people in a situation where they're unable to kill themselves as any other person would be able to. And that itself is discrimination. So finally, another point for assisted suicide and euthanasia would be the fact that actually, if we look at consequentialism, as we did earlier on in a different video, that sort of school of thinking says that it's not the acts you do, it's the consequences of the acts that matter. And in this instance, you could say that actually, although the act of killing someone or helping someone to end their life is thought to be a bad thing in general, the consequences could actually outweigh that, in that you are stopping suffering, you're enabling someone to carry out something that they want but are unable to do themselves. And also you could think about the fact that how come withdrawing treatment, so withdrawing a ventilator, stopping someone's medication which is keeping them alive, legally at the moment that's allowed, whereas euthanasia is not allowed. But they both have the same consequence, they both have the same outcome. So why should we treat them any different?
So a final point against legalising assisted suicide and euthanasia would be the aim of medicine is to preserve life. And if we legalise one form of intentional killing, where is that going to stop? It's a slippery slope. Where are we going to draw the line? If someone has a few years to live, do we think it's acceptable to end their life there? Do we think it's acceptable to start to use people for things like organ donation? So that would be a very extreme part of the slippery slope argument. And there's also people's personal beliefs about life being sacred, about us not playing some kind of deity and deciding when and where someone should die, that it should be a natural process. And that would be a final argument for why why we shouldn't legalise euthanasia.
So as we've shown you, legally we have one framework to discuss euthanasia and assisted suicide, in that in the UK they're both illegal, whereas ethically it's a bit less black and white. There are lots of different arguments for and against the legalisation of both assisted suicide and euthanasia, and it's something to bear in mind as you go through clinical practice and go through interviews, because it's still very much at the forefront of many people's minds, and it's still something that is likely to keep coming up in the news as we go ahead.
So those were some of the arguments for and against assisted suicide, sort of on ethical grounds, and I think that's the sort of stuff that you probably want to know for your interviews in case it comes up. You can have a discussion about those issues. So yeah, that brings us to the end of this video. We've talked about 3 of the cases. We've talked about Diane Pretty, Purdy and Daniel James. Again, links in the description below along with timestamps, so you can go over that again if you feel like it. And we've mentioned the Lord Falconer bill, which again you can read more about if you like. Yeah, thank you very much for watching. This concludes our, the second of our 2 videos about end-of-life ethics. We've talked about euthanasia, we've talked about kind of definitions. To reiterate again, please never use the phrase passive euthanasia, because it's just confusing and will get you confused. We've talked about the Dr. Cox case, and we've talked about some other sort of cases around this topic. So I hope between these 2 videos we've given you a reasonable overview of what the issues are in this debate, and I hope that you've been able to take something away that might help you for your interviews or for your later life as a doctor, or just just generally being more aware of the ethics surrounding end of life medicine. I know it's a difficult area to deal with, but to be honest, it's what we deal with on a day-to-day basis as doctors, and there's really no getting around that fact. So yeah, thank you very much for watching. If you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please consider doing so. We've got a few more videos in this medical ethics series coming out, along with a few more about interviews, and then we'll be going into some more uncharted territory on this YouTube channel. And I'm going to leave you with Charlotte and Molly basically saying thank you and saying goodbye. So I'll see you next time.
So thank you very much for watching. We hope you found it useful, and we'll see you again in future videos when we'll discuss some more ethical issues.
Bye. I love my little bye at the end.